Loki was a beacon of hope in an otherwise mediocre run of MCU projects. While Thunderbolts may indicate Marvel's return to form, Loki held things together for years in a literal and metaphorical sense. Avengers. Endgame gave us our first glimpse of time travel in the MCU. But moving past the Infinity Saga, Marvel had the daunting task of setting up the multiverse, which is an inherently confusing concept. A big blockbuster movie is the right place to establish rules that will ripple through the rest of Phases 4 and 5. Marvel blockbusters draw a wider audience, meaning a larger section of audiences will have a grasp of what's going on later on, should they choose to dip in and out of the MCU. Nevertheless, Marvel didn't have any time to waste. With Spider-Man, No Way Home and Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness on the horizon, they needed to set up the multiverse quickly and relied on Loki to lay everything out. Endgame established basic time travel concepts. Unlike most other time travel movies, changing past events doesn't always impact the future. If you go back in time, the past becomes your present, and your actions open up new branch timelines that deviate from your reality. Loki introduced the TVA to organize and maintain these various branching timelines, establishing the MCU as the sacred timeline. This gave Marvel a lot of agency moving forward. It allowed previous non-MCU movies to technically exist as canon in another reality, like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies and Blade. It also meant Marvel could cherry-pick which time-altering events were allowed and which weren't. Loki's escape from the Avengers Tower in Endgame was not a canonical event, and so the TVA pruned him. However, Steve Rogers, Chris Evans, and Peter Parker's Tom Holland time travel shenanigans were permitted, as they all served the sacred timeline. Marvel became the real-world equivalent of the TVA, selecting whichever characters and plots best served the overarching narrative of Phases 4 and 5. Loki had implications for every subsequent Marvel movie and became a pillar of the MCU's broader narrative. Loki became so integral to the MCU that the show's writers collaborated with the writers of Multiverse of Madness to ensure Doctor Strange, Benedict Cumberbatch, didn't breach any timeline rules. In an interview with Digital Spy, Loki writer Michael Waldron explained, "I came in with institutional knowledge of the multiverse and was able to get the creative team of Doctor Strange on the same page as me." While Multiverse of Madness doesn't explicitly meddle with time, it follows Stephen Strange traveling across various branching timelines. When developing Loki, Waldron hadn't realized his series had become the blueprint for the entire multiverse. There were times when I was like, oh shit, I wish I hadn't have defined it so clearly. Considering Loki was an experimental new venture for Marvel, it's surprising they gave the writers so much responsibility, where their rules would dictate the future of the multiverse saga. Loki changed the MCU in a literal sense, both in the real world and in the universe, but its narrative changed everything in a completely different way. Loki dialed down the action and spectacle that Marvel fans had become so accustomed to. The story was an in-depth character study for one of the MCU's most iconic villains. The first few episodes followed Agent Mobius, Owen Wilson, interrogating Loki, which acted more as a therapy session. Mobius took Loki on a tour of his entire life, forcing him into a position where he couldn't rely on his power, wit, or charm to worm his way out of the situation. Mobius stripped away Loki's ego and made him confront his identity. The rest of the series followed Loki as he reflected on how his ego and hubris had ruined his life and left him destined for failure. The god of mischief went on a journey to discover his humanity. He fell in love with Sylvie Sophia Di Martino, a female variant of himself, which became a genius metaphor that illustrated how Loki was learning to love himself. Loki became the first truly character-driven story that redefined a character and suddenly turned a recurring villain into the MCU's most fleshed-out, morally complex character. Even more surprising is that the story had a definitive ending. We'll surely see Loki again in Avengers Doomsday, but you could watch 2 seasons of Loki and be satisfied with a well-rounded story. Loki balanced such an intimate story with a plot that completely transformed the state of the MCU, which is incredibly impressive. We've seen Loki's influence in subsequent Marvel projects, which have stood out from the rest of their mediocre output. Loki set a new standard for character-driven stories. This isn't to say that past MCU films didn't explore fantastic characters. Marvel explored Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr., and Steve Rogers, Chris Evans, with similar complexity, though it took them 10 years of movies to capture the same degree of complexity as 2 seasons of Loki. Phase 4 was rocky, and Phase 5 has been a little hit and miss. However, Phase 5 has seen success whenever it focuses on its characters. Deadpool and Wolverine juggled a lot of characters and dimension jumping, but it maintained focus on its leads, who underwent a story of redemption and acceptance of their past mistakes. Similarly, Daredevil, Born Again, and Thunderbolts are Marvel's latest projects, and both were praised for their attention to character development. While each of these projects has a team of talented writers and actors who developed those characters, Loki's success helped Marvel remember their secret ingredient: complex characters. Loki's stakes are enormous, but the story feels intimate. The same is true for Thunderbolts, which has huge ramifications for the MCU. The film introduced Marvel's strongest character, the Sentry, Lewis Pullman, and established a new Avengers team. Nevertheless, the story felt incredibly intimate and honed in on its morally ambiguous character's search for redemption. Loki is the architect of Marvel's timelines in the story, but he's also the architect of Marvel's recent success in the real world.